Welcome to Reducing Bias in Member Selection, a webinar for VISTA sponsors and leaders. Despite differences in their roles, sponsors, supervisors, and leaders are all involved in member selection. This webinar focuses on screening, interviewing, and selecting VISTA members, and looks at debiasing strategies to use during these phases of member recruitment. I'm your host, Andy King, Senior Training Specialist with AmeriCorps Vista, and I'm pleased to introduce you to our presenter, Jinlin Wu. Jin is a Vista alum, and she served in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th classes of the program beginning in 1968. Jin has been involved with justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion work for more than 5 decades. She has called many places home, including Seattle, Brooklyn, New York City, Los Angeles, Boston, Portland, Honolulu, and Micronesia. Currently, she resides in Seattle. Jin, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Andy. And hello, everyone. I'm glad to be joining you for this important conversation and to provide participants with information that will help them apply an even stronger equity lens to future member screening, interviewing, and selection process. Let's take a look at what we've planned for this webinar. We'll start by clarifying the role of equity in recruitment, specifically during screening, interviewing, and selection. Next, we'll identify where unconscious bias may show up in these processes. Lastly, we identify strategies and lenses to adapt and adopt in order to make screening, interviewing, and selection processes more equitable. But we'd like to begin by hearing from you. Andy will explain.
All right, so we'd like to bring you into the discussion with a chat question. And again, if you don't have the chat panel open, you can select the speech bubble icon, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. So our discussion question is this: how confident are you that you could identify practices that can introduce bias into the member selection process? So you could say it in a few words, or if you want to give a little more explanation, that's fine. But again, how confident are you that you could identify practices that can introduce bias into a member selection process? Again, once you've written your response, be sure you send it to everyone so that all the participants will be able to see it. All right, so we've had a fair number of you writing in. Some of you said somewhat confident. There's a bunch of people who are fairly confident, pretty confident. Even some folks like 7 out of 10 giving us some numerical. But a couple of you have mentioned that either you're not quite sure where your own ability is, and you realize that there's stuff we're not aware of, unconscious biases we're going to talk about, and then others who recognize that there's always more to learn and that we don't want to become overconfident because we can then lose sight of some things that could be at work. So Jin, anything that you can draw from these responses?
On one hand, it's just great that people have been, making a focus of their study and learning the whole topic of unconscious bias. So I'm grateful to see how many people have already been a part of that conversation. Equally well, I know that, there's always room for the growth, and we're just grateful that folks have showed up for the webinar and that there's an opportunity in front of us to do some sharing, as well as to just strengthen, our commitment to minimizing and managing and removing barriers to member recruitment. So I just appreciate everyone's answer and glad you're here.
So before we discuss how to reduce bias, it might be helpful to briefly look at the roles that leaders and sponsors have during each step of the recruitment process. These steps come with responsibility and weight, of course, because they impact real people, your applicants. So looking at the screening phase, Vista leaders can conduct initial screening to determine whether an applicant has the minimum qualifications for the role, and then a leader could recommend those who appear to be best qualified so that the supervisor can then review them for possible interview. Supervisors in the screening phase are responsible for the criminal background and other formal screening, and then in choosing which applicants get an interview. Moving on to the interview phase, leaders can take on a lot of responsibility in managing the logistics of the interview process, and that could include contacting applicants, scheduling the interviews, responding to their questions, scheduling panelists, and setting up conference calls and more. There's a lot of details in setting up interviews. Leaders can also suggest potential questions to ask during the interview, and then, of course, participate on a panel. It's the supervisors who are responsible for finalizing the interview format and the questions, and identifying and preparing the interview panel, and then leading the interviews themselves. And of course, the final selection of candidates and notification is done by the supervisor. So that's just a quick look at roles. We'll turn it back over to Jen to hear more about equity.
Thank you, Andy. So this slide reminds us that equity is a concept of treating everyone fairly by acknowledging everyone's unique situation and addressing systemic barriers. While equity sounds fair, equality sounds fair, equity is in fact the approach that is fair. The aim of equity is to ensure that everyone has access to equal results and benefits. For decades now, the work to address disparities in our labor force and employment systems has maintained a lens on the role of unconscious bias across the key functions of attracting, hiring, developing, and retaining a diverse workforce. Because in our National Service volunteer recruitment system, we continue to filter in some group identities and filter out others, we too are paying attention to unconscious bias. We are committed to learning more about how unconscious bias operates and what debiasing strategies could and should we adapt in order to bring about even greater inclusion. In the essential work, we see you, our sponsors and our leaders, as critical partners in this pursuit. When we're committed to equity, our constant reflection needs to be about which populations might be constantly filtered in and filtered out. What might be operating to contribute to this filtering, and what can we do about it? We can think about this in two broad categories of characteristics around which people could have biases. The first are primary dimensions of diversity, such as race, ethnicity, gender, age, sexual orientation, physical and mental abilities, and national origin. And then there are second dimensions like spirituality, economic class, political beliefs, work style, geographic location, to name a few. Let's be clear, the webinar is not about shaming, blaming, or pointing fingers. We openly acknowledge that we all hold both conscious and unconscious biases, as do the systems and processes we set up. We also know that we can work together to strengthen our teams and systems so they are more equitable outcomes are possible for all. We understand that the reasons folks are not joining us to serve as AmeriCorps members are varied. Some which are currently beyond our control, like economics, family responsibilities, alternative views about service, and personal circumstances. Nevertheless, we're eager to reduce the likelihood of unconscious bias as a factor. Our data on VISTA membership informs us that despite our standing commitment and deep desire to recruit fairly and engage inclusively, we know that populations that join us as AmeriCorps Vistas are not fully representative of all the diversity which resides in our communities. Andy, please briefly share with us some of the AmeriCorps data that gives us glimpses into what dimensions of cultural identity we might need to take a closer look at.
Sure thing. So we looked at a year's worth of VISTA applications, and then we did a comparison of those who were selected to serve, those who became members, compared to those who weren't selected, and I'll just call those applicants. So we have the applicants in the member group. We found that the two groups were really very similar in some demographics like race, gender, veteran status, and citizenship status, but that they differ slightly when looking at age and education level. So in terms of age, applicants who are aged 25 and under were more likely to be selected to serve than were applicants in the next two age groups, that is 26 to 35 and 36 to 49. At age 50 and beyond, again, there's essentially no difference between applicants and members. I know the numbers here are probably small and hard to see. Looking at education level, we see that applicants with a 4-year degree are selected at slightly lower rates than those who had graduate degrees or higher. So slight differences, it's really hard to know what these mean, right? These data alone can't tell us whether bias is playing a role in creating these differences. We would need to understand more about how we as humans use information to make decisions, and then how our personal experiences can shape the outcomes.
Thanks, Andy. So unconscious bias. We know that many of you from your first response to the first chat question, have been a part of the conversation for a long time. And for others of you, the idea of unconscious bias might be a newer conversation. So let's review a definition and clarify why it's important. So we know that any given moment, our brains are receiving 11 million pieces of information plus, according to research from Paradigm, a consulting firm specializing in workplace inclusivity. We can only consciously process about 40 of those pieces. In order to process the remaining 10 million plus bits of information, we rely on our subconscious, which helps us filter information by taking mental shortcuts. Unconscious bias refers to the information, attitudes, and stereotypes that inform our subconscious information processing and dictate the process by which we take these mental shortcuts. While unconscious bias processing is a critical, unconscious information processing is a critical part of human functioning, the shortcuts we take and the bias that informs those shortcuts often introduce errors into our decision-making. Unconscious bias can form based on our education, socialization, lived experience, social environments, and exposure to print and visual media, which frequently embed stereotypes, biased and skewed messages and images into our subconscious. Often unbeknownst to us, we are processing information about what groups and identities are trustworthy, competent, truthful, reliable, conscientious, hardworking, timely, or capable. At the same time, we are also absorbing harmful messaging about specific cultural groups and intersectional identities, who are being falsely depicted as being less moral, more problematic, more prone to violence or aggression, untrustworthy, and potentially unsafe to associate with. A portion of our member selection strategizing must include devoting energies to managing and minimizing the influence and impact that unconscious bias has on our decision about who to screen in or out, who to choose to interview or not, and who we ultimately select to nominate for AmeriCorps Vista member service. If we are to truly address the unconscious bias that often prevents a greater cross-section of culturally diverse individuals from serving as national service volunteers, we must employ a multi-level approach. That is, working at the individual, organizational, and institutional levels simultaneously. This webinar's focus is on the organizational level. The work of equity requires that at the organizational level, we begin to engage in critical thinking about big picture questions. This slide displays 5 questions we believe that are helpful for organizational leaders to keep posing and answering, regardless of where they might be in the member recruitment cycle. First, take the time to slow down processes in order to disrupt the automatic mental processing that could occur. Unconscious bias is minimized when critical thinking has an opportunity to inform decision-making. Continually ask and discuss. What unconscious bias are common here? And what false assumptions or associations might we be making? Is the information we're using to make judgments about competency or fitness to serve truly relevant, accurate, or important? What in the applicant's history speaks to their suitability for this particular service assignment that we might not be looking at? Which cultural groups and social identities are advantaged and disadvantaged by our processes? How might the cultural membership, socialization, lived experience, or education of the reviewers act as a barrier to an applicant's ability to receive a fair chance at AmeriCorps Vista selection? On your screen, you'll see a poll here. Your efforts to engage with each of these questions at the program site is so important. Help us understand via the poll where you currently are in your journey to apply this equity lens questions to member screening. Andy, are people able to access the poll?
Yeah, it looks like we've got about 60% of folks responding.
Oh, thank you. My screen isn't showing it, sorry.
No worries. All right, we'll give you just a couple more seconds to respond in the poll, and make sure if after you make your selection that you click submit so that it gets tallied up. And all right, so we'll go ahead and we'll close the poll now and take a look at the responses that you've submitted. And so it looks like 9% of you are unsure where you are with these questions. 16% are getting started applying this kind of equity lens. 47%, almost half of you, are working on it. And then 28% say that you already got processes in place. So those were the results. Thank you for participating. And Jen, back over to you.
Thank you. You know, we like to cite the good work that's happening across the country, and members of Serve Philadelphia VistaCorps work with city departments to address the root causes and injustices of poverty for Philadelphians. Serve Philadelphia recruits for multiple project sites, and all applicants complete an application on their website to apply to work across 18 different departments. On their main application page, they have a statement that reads that marginalized communities are less likely to apply unless they meet every qualification, and that SER Philadelphia deems all experience relevant and encourages marginalized folks from non-traditional career paths to consider applying. During this presentation, we'll share a few tips and tools from this project screening and interviewing process that demonstrates just how hard they have worked to be equitable. In the chat, we're posting a link to a packet and several tools we'll mention in the presentation today. SER Philadelphia received training from an organization called Management Center and based many of the tools on their work with them. And they wanted to definitely give credit and attribution to them. You'll also see a link to the Management Center site, which has more resources on the topic. And we're happy to share that. Conditions that amplify our need to address unconscious bias include when our socialization and lived experience is very homogeneous and our exposure has been mainly limited to people with whom we share cultural identity and membership. Additionally, when our exposure has not included anti-bias education, where prevailing stereotypes, untruths, myths, and false narratives are challenged. These stereotypes can be based on race, ethnicity, gender identity, age, disability, national origin, sexual orientation, economic class, geographic region, immigration status, or a combination of these dimensions. Thirdly, when the people tasked with the AmeriCorps Vista recruitment have not been trained to address unconscious bias. So we all need to pay attention, and we need to pay attention especially when these things are, three things are operating. Now I'd like to direct your focus to working on debiasing recruitment by applying an equity lens to all the activities that typically make up the screening process. The screening process typically includes some combination of these three steps. Step one involves accepting, organizing applications and other materials, and making sure the submissions is complete. This may involve some follow-up with candidates to submit missing pieces, putting folks into tracking databases or systems. Step two is a step that can take some time and includes a lot of activities. This is where applications are screened and rated by an individual or groups. This is where the application contents, which includes a resume, cover letter, or other materials, are reviewed and rated to see if the information the individual provides aligns with the position description. A screening tool or a set of tools could be used to rate each application, and often screeners are employing a process they have been trained to use. And the final step is the screening process is to decide who does and does not get an interview. Rating of each applicant is synthesized, and then some applicants will be notified that they won't be interviewed, and some will have interviews scheduled. This step may include providing additional information about the next steps in the process for those moving forward with the interview. Depending on your organization's size, we know that these steps can be accomplished by just a few or a whole team of individuals. A good practice to identify potential bias at each step of the screening process is to ask yourself and your team 3 questions to take a closer, deeper look at the places where unconscious bias might be at play. The first question is, what information collected in this step could yield a judgment? Next, what unconscious bias related to all those dimensions of diversity could be at play at this step? Once you surface those answers, you'll want to ask what debiasing strategies could we employ to mitigate the bias? Now we're going to take a closer look at each step, applying these 3 questions. With step one, the work is to organize applications and ensure that submissions and other materials are complete. Our first question helps us pause and account for all the information that could be filtered in during this particular step that could yield early judgments. Let's visualize this together. In your mind, bring into view an application. Think about the many bits of information that are being provided in an application. Person's name, geographic location, age, education, and social background. The second question has us examine the different types of unconscious bias and assumptions that could be at play given what we flagged in the first question. With a person's name, one might make quick judgments about the applicant's ethnicity or gender that could connect to unconscious mental associations that could lead to assumptions about their suitability or not. Unchecked gender, racial, or age bias can lead to an early determination about an applicant's competency or proficiency. As well, studies have shown that even the level of familiarity or identification with a person's name can yield different results. Most screeners tend to favor names that are familiar to them over those that are not. Names they can pronounce over ones they struggle with. In a similar way, unchecked stereotypes about specific generation or age groups can lead to detrimental assumptions. Asking what is a debiasing strategy we could employ is our next logical step. In this instance, we have come to learn that redacting a person's name from an application prior to review can be a powerful tool in removing name recognition and ethnic and gender bias from the equation. Importantly, people responsible for organizing applications and checking for completeness need to be well trained in the practice of redacting. The work to check for completeness and the decision actions one takes in the face of what we might deem incomplete can also be ripe for unconscious bias. When organizations take care and time to establish a clear and standard protocol for handlers when they face incompleteness, this step is far less likely to be influenced by an individual handler's bias. An example from Serve Philadelphia is how they address the screening step and potential disparities. So Serve at Philadelphia provides some research about how to develop a resume to potential applicants on their website. So this is pre-application. Some people don't have a resume and they may not know how to put one together that highlights transferable skills they have from their life and previous work or volunteer experience that is needed in a service role. Additionally, Serve Philly hosts a number of open houses or information sessions, both in person and virtual, to answer questions about serving with them and also to provide space for people to access computers, the internet, and to complete their applications. I think I know about 7 different organizations that actually do open houses where they help people prepare their applications. Okay, screening, step 2. So the work is reviewing and rating applications and identifying applicants who look like promising matches. Again, let's take time to visualize together the different kinds of information and the potential conscious and unconscious judgments we might be making as we review and rate the application, resume, and references. Even with the names of applicants redacted during step 1, during step 2, we are reading potential information that relates to geographic location, education, social background, and maybe level of English fluency, disability, global exposure, and social and economic background. Additionally, the resume and references may provide clues into the cultural identities and affiliations of applicants. Embedded in applicant responses are information about or possible indicators about ethnicity, gender, family status, parental status, sexual orientation, religion, spirituality, and political persuasion or commitments. With competent unconscious bias training, we know that bias exists on all those levels and are associated with all those dimensions. As we pursue our third question about debiasing strategies, we can adapt and adopt. What comes to mind is the promising practice of creating a screening tool that requires raters to uniformly use the same criteria. Raters need to have their training about the screening tool and processes and all the unconscious bias that will be present when looking at the applications, resumes, and references. Also, because the work to address unconscious bias is not a one and done, it is recommended that screeners continue to seek out individually bias training to continue to deepen their bias awareness.
So we'd like to hear from you again, and this time, what you are thinking about other ideas and strategies that you could use to apply to the review and rating part of the screening process. So again, we'll use the chat to get your ideas. And again, the question is, what debiasing strategy would you apply to the review and rating part of the screening process? And again, be sure you're sending your response to everyone so everyone can see what you're contributing. All right, so we've had just a couple of responses come in. One is to use a rubric to elevate candidates. Another is the practice of redacting, right, to remove information that could lead to or introduce bias into the selection process. So just a couple of responses there. Jen, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment about the feedback we're getting in the chat that, when you think about when we have systemic bias, a good response is to create an alternative system. So the idea of a rubric, an idea of standardizing so that we, are not so influenced by individual bias, but that we have had a conversation and that we've created some tool that we can agree upon and that we're applying uniformly so that applicants have a fairer chance of being seen. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next slide. And this has to do with the screening reflection. Deciding who ultimately moves on to get an interview is step 3. The process and protocol an organization implements to decide who receives an interview and can be a fair one, or one that remains unchecked for unconscious bias, or is one that leaves itself open the undue influence of just a select few individuals. An effective debiasing strategy organizations are using involves using a rubric. And this was something that I think Marissa called out for, to rate applicants. Numbers are assigned to specific criteria, and there exists a point total determination about who will and will not progress to the interview stage. Additionally, when organizations take actions to ensure that the rating team is comprised of individuals that are representative of a cross-section of cultural diversity, the opportunities to control bias increases. Regarding rating protocol, the strategy that has been proven to be helpful is to put in place predetermined guidance about what will become of those folks who are deemed borderline or on the cusp. So if you have a procedure already in place, then we've been finding organizations are much more successful. Once again, let's turn to Serve Philly, where they have implemented the strategy where every applicant is offered a phone screening interview, which provides them with key information about requirements, benefits, what Vista focuses on, and about the program and process. The phone screening also includes questions to ask each candidate based on 7 core values of the program, as well as questions about why the candidate wants to join Vista. Do you understand how one decision to grant each applicant the phone screening could help level the playing field for those applicants that would be disadvantaged due to lack of experience and or access to information that could help them be successful with their interview?
So we'd like to hear from you again. We have another chat activity here to see if you have any more ideas about debiasing the decision on who gets an interview. So again, in the chat, we've got this question for your response. What debiasing strategy could you apply when deciding who gets an interview? All right, so we've gotten a few responses in. There seems to be some commonality using a checklist when doing the reviews and scoring. Several of you mentioned using a scoring system or some kind of method to give a numerical score. So Jen, what do you make of these responses?
That's great. And I know that it's embedded in folks' answer, but people who are newer to the conversation, the score, it's very important to train the team, to score in the same manner. So you can have a scoring tool, but it really helps that people have several practices using it and having conversation about, the scoring so that we know that we're scoring in the same manner. Thank you for those responses. On the next slide, where as we move off of screening, just wanted to highlight a couple more debiasing strategies. You'll notice that in the diagram, hold on, there's going to be a graphic that comes up. So these 3, we've already given some space to: the training of screeners, redacting, and using a screening tool. There's 2 more that I'd like to just bring to your attention. So when when screeners are challenged to think more deeply about what's actually needed for Vista members to be successful in carrying out the duties of their service assignment, and also directed to place greater emphasis on skills and competencies and lived experience over evidence of formal education and the getting of degrees, we evidence an important shift. The inclusion of a greater array of applicants coming from more non-traditional, less resourced, and more marginalized backgrounds is brought into consideration. So the focusing of skills really becomes a strategy and an avenue that we haven't pursued enough. As well, when screeners are provided training and discussion to better understand how seemingly unrelated experiences could provide evidence of key skills needed for a position, we again see a shift to a reality where there's greater inclusion in the pool of applicants deemed worthy to receive an interview. And so we need to look at those applications really with some fresh eyes and with some new criteria. In this next section, we'll move on to take a parallel look at the interview process. So this process you'll be familiar with, typically includes 3 phases and several activities, within each phase. The pre-interview involves developing an interview protocol with clear directions on scoring During the pre-interview period, the panel reviews the protocol, the interview questions, and the scoring information. The committee is convened and trained and is prepared for the actual interview. When applicable, the organization recruitment team provides interviewees with any information they might need to prepare for the interview. Serve Philadelphia makes it a practice to provide the interview questions to all interviewees ahead of time, so they all have a chance to really think about the questions, understand the process in detail before interviewing, and fully prepare to answer the questions. During the actual interview, which includes things such as setup, introductions, information sharing, questions, and wrap up, it's important to have each member of the committee score candidates separately on their own, definitely prior to any discussion. In this way, the influence of the more dominating voices or individuals with more positional power is managed and lessened. During the post-interview phase, the interview is debriefed and the scoring of each candidate is reviewed and typically ranked. When we have worked hard to address and mitigate the presence of unconscious bias throughout the interview process, top of mind are the erroneous assumptions one might make about what is heard during an interview regarding both the substance of an applicant's answer to essential questions and the biased judgments one might make based on an applicant's oral presentation, separate from content of essential answers. Rubrics, predetermined criteria, established protocols, and trained interview panel members can all contribute to interview conditions whereby each applicant can be assured that they have received fair treatment and consideration. Nevertheless, studies into unconscious bias inform us that interviewers can listen to the same applicant and end up rating an applicant quite differently depending on their feelings, cultural memberships, and the associations they make to an applicant's fluency with standard English, the presence of non-standard English accent, their tone of voice, volume, pace of speech, production, etc. As well, interviewers have been known to score higher the responses of applicants with whom they assume shared aspects of their cultural membership and social identities, such as gender, sexual orientation, religion, ethnicity, family status, parental status. The level of comfort individuals have with the familiar can often translate to more favorable ratings, but not always. The literature on unconscious bias also informs us there also exists incidences when interviewers and applicants can share aspects of cultural membership, but due to internalization of prevailing stereotypes and misinformation, can end up giving a consistently lower rating based on a particular aspect of shared social identity. For example, some interviewers who identify as female may consistently misjudge female applicants as being less proficient, less reliable, or loyal due to gender bias and false assumptions about females in the workplace. Dimensions such as ethnicity and gender identity will receive consistently a lower rating due to the internalization of prevailing stereotypes, despite the fact that the interviewer is a member of a group that is being discriminated against.
All right, so we'd like to hear from you again, this time around interviewing. So you've had some practice thinking about bias in the screening step and strategies to debias there. And so we'd like to give you a chance to share your thoughts about strategies to debias interview activities. So the question is, what debiasing strategies could you apply to the interviewing process activities? Again, jot your ideas down in the chat and select everyone before you send them. All right, so seen some responses come in. Thank you for those who are participating. And suggestions include protocols, training, scoring individually, and then using a panel to make the decision. Panel decisions come up a couple of times here. Let's see, this one says we use score sheets and debrief at the conclusion and then share the scores. Additionally, we review the procedure within the team and then the process with the candidate. So lots of checking around to get different perspectives and input about the process itself. Let's see, for remote interviews, perhaps having the video off rather than forcing a video interview. All right, and then a number of you also underscoring the need for training, using a scoring rubric, and having a panel of interviewers. So thank you for all those responses. Jin, any thoughts about what you're seeing here?
Just appreciate everybody's responses. And, you know, I think it was Jonathan had the idea about the camera off on the video interview, you know, that we could have just such a rich conversation about that one suggestion, you know, and how, you know, it harkens back to the very famous process whereby in trying to diversify orchestra members and, you know, erecting a curtain. And so the visual component is taken out so that what we're simply hearing in a recital is the performance of the individual and not making some assumptions that we're unaware of. So thank you for that. I'm just watching our time and we have a few more things to share. So I'm going to move on. Just wanted to really quickly, you know, highlight some of the strategies that we're promoting. And Stephanie, if you go ahead and bring up the whole visual, that'd be great. So, you know, here we have on the screen the scoring protocol that many of you are familiar with already, and the, you know, intentional work to make sure that you recruit a diverse panel, you know, and that they are trained and that you're using a rubric. And I think it's not a small thing. That fourth point is just make sure that before you discuss, give everybody time to work on their own notes and sets, because once you start the discussion, people's minds start shifting and they're no longer necessarily basing it on what they perceived and took in, but they're being influenced by other people's points of view. So just really important to do that. We mentioned that we're going to be sharing a number of resources with you. We just wanted, for those of you that are less familiar with the rubric, this is again a tool that we are going to be able to share from Serve Philadelphia and the work of the Management Center. And you'll notice that one of the, you'll notice that they must have one of those skills is relationship building. And so then they have given thought to then, you know, when someone's answer, you know, what is a strongly agree answer? What's an agree answer? What's a disagree answer? You know, so in terms of trying to assess relationship building, this is a sample of the rubric they're willing to share. And we'll have a chance to give that to you and for you to use. Stephanie, can you advance to the next one? Before we move off interviewing, I want to discuss the interview process and how it's really a two-way process. So the interviewee may be wondering, is the culture of this organization the right fit for me? Will I find welcome, safety, respect, and belonging here? And do I have a strong chance of being successful here? It's important to acknowledge the applicant's wonderings about diversity and difference. While the interview panel is using the opportunity to learn more about the applicant at the same time is using the opportunity to collect information and impressions that allow them to make their own judgments. These wonderings are particularly germane when applicants do not see examples of their social identities on the interview panel, in the staffing, at the organization's site, on the website, or across the service delivery. If greater diversity in AmeriCorps Vista team is a goal, it would be important for different spokespeople to address the values and aspirations the organization holds about inclusion, cultural diversity, and equity. The commitment the organization has to extending welcome, safety, respect, and belonging to everyone. The ongoing commitment the organization has to building the team's awareness about a broad spectrum of cultural diversity, and the support a member can expect to receive to help them be successful in their service. With the remaining time, I'd like to briefly showcase two debiasing practices that relate to the selection process. The first strategy is, prior to discussion, have each reviewer write a brief summary for each top candidate outlining why they were selected or not selected, and reference specific elements of their application or interview responses. The second entails enlisting another hiring manager or interested and credible third party in the organization to review the top candidates and your selection before you make any announcements or notifications. You see how each of these approaches can work to help minimize either the presence of dominating voices or increase an applicant's chances of receiving a fair review.
All right, so we have one last chance for you to participate here this time, so you can see how well you've been following along with the presentation. You'll see a poll pop up on your screen, and we'd like you to answer this question. Which of the following is most likely to introduce bias into a member selection process? So pick one of those responses and click submit. And I'll give you a chance to think and respond. Give you a few more seconds to get your responses in. Yeah, all right. Looks like most of you have had a chance to respond. So we'll go ahead and look at the correct answer here. So the best answer was B, where a supervisor conducts all the interviews by herself. So in general, having only one interviewer could allow that one person's unconscious biases to affect the outcome. And as some of you had noted earlier, a diverse panel of interviewers is likely to counteract any individual biases that might arise. It would make the overall process more equitable. So good work. Most of you got that correct. Thank you for your participation.
Before we let you go, I wanted to make sure that we're continuing to add a few resources to your toolbox. Some of you may be familiar with these, but these are 3 really good resources we'd like to recommend. So one is, the IAT and Harvard's Project Implicit. So if you don't, just please use the link that we're going to provide you and take a look and get familiar with the IAT. The next one we are recommending an article from the Harvard Business School that's about actively addressing unconscious bias in recruiting. And we'll also provide you that link. And the last article is don't talk about implicit bias without talking about structural racism. And that is provided to us by the National Equity Project housed in Oakland, California. So just three more resources for your toolbox.
And in terms of resources, thank you for those, Jen. I want to just mention that Vista is about to publish a new course on poverty on the Vista campus, and there will be 4 modules in this course. It includes an overview of poverty in the United States, a module on how poverty is measured, approaches to reducing poverty, and then understanding poverty in your own community. The series is going to be part of Vista member orientation and replacing older content there on similar topics. We'll also publish it separately in the Understanding Poverty in the U.S. learning path, so anyone can access it. I do want to mention that incoming members who are enrolled in the May Vista member orientation next month, they'll experience these new courses as part of their early service coursework. And of course, any campus user is welcome to take a look. So the link to Vista member orientation, I'll share that in the follow-up, so you'll be able to see where these are located in our follow-up email. I'm going to shift gears now and ask you to share what you think about this webinar. We've got a quick poll, a quick survey to get your thoughts. It may already be open in your browser window, but if not, we'll share the link in the chat. We definitely review, I personally read all the comments that come in. So really welcome your feedback, as that helps us determine how we can improve our presentations. And I want to thank you in advance for sharing your thoughts. So we've hit the top of the hour. Let's see, in terms of questions, if you have them, you can post them to the Q&A. We may not have time to answer them here, but we can certainly follow up with you afterwards. And to Marissa's question, the slides and resources, there's a link in the chat. If you just scroll up, you'll be able to see the link to the slides. I'll also follow up with all of you by email with a link to the recording, and again, the slides and the examples that were shared from Serve Philadelphia. Also want to invite you to next month's webinar, which is on coaching members for successful service. That'll be on May 23rd, same time, 3 p.m. Eastern. You'll get an email invitation, so watch your inbox for that. And I want to thank our presenter, Jinlin Wu, for sharing all this incredible information with us today. Also thanks to our instructional designers, Bethany DeSoblin, Elizabeth Floyd, and Karen Greenup, as well as our producer today, Stephanie Natoli. Most of all, thank you for all your participation. That concludes our webinar. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.